First webinar series for 2022, hosted by our history department from the University of the Free State, as well as our Sovereign Journal for Contemporary History. I'm Ricky Olofse. I'm a senior lecturer at this university, UFS, and it's really my privilege to be the discussant and the facilitator for today's session. Just some house rules. I will introduce Professor Simpson just now, and then we will give him up to 30-40 minutes to discuss this wonderful, I must say, wonderful new edition of a thick book to our wonderful new General Histories of South Africa. And then there will be a 20-minute time for any questions. And then I will take a question, we will pose it to Professor Simpson, and then he will have time to answer it. Professor Simpson, thank you. It is such a privilege that you can be here with us. We were talking about his book a little bit earlier, and it's like it's been blown away. There are some reviews that's been already included in the book, but from the reviews in the newspapers from the book, it is highlighted with headings like history writing at its best, narrative history at its best. Someone, Lindy Quid, said this is the first historian who successfully is integrating black and white histories in a single narrative. So congratulations with this book, and really we're privileged to have you here. Just to quickly introduce you to our audience, you are an associate professor presently based at University of Pretoria, and your earlier research focused on the ANC liberation struggle with your book on Umkhonto with Sizwe, the ANC armed struggle, which was published by Penguin Random House in 2016, and again, they are the publishing house in now 2021 who published this wonderful new book. We're looking forward to your discussion. When we look at your abstract, there are plus minus 7 things that you told us you're going to focus on. We are looking forward to hear about the challenges in writing this book. I can just imagine in a lockdown COVID-19 period where you are depending on archives and archival research. Also, the typical thing that goes along with a historian is selection, what to put in the book, what to leave out. Also, you said from your previous research with Umkhonto with Sizwe, how did this actually line up the military side to this book? There's a lot of reviews focusing on the fact that you take out military aspects and focus that also in between the narrative that you are giving as the golden thread. You didn't leave that military aspect also out. And then you said you're also going to focus on how this book, and I can just imagine, compared to what has been previously given to us by previous general histories in South Africa, because yours, there's something different. And just to say, just in the table of content, I was blown away because I was expecting typically all these different subheadings, and it's not there. It's short and sweet table of content that I suppose adding to the narrative. Then you also said you're going to look on how this book also give us some issues with regard to the discussion on decolonialism in universities. And then something that I didn't expect. And I would like to see what you're going to say about that. It starts with 1902, with the aftermath of the Anglo-Boer War, and it ends with the COVID-19 pandemic. But in between, you said you want to give us something of a hope for the future. So I would like to see how you connect that happening from the past to our present, and somewhere give us hope as readers. And then also you said you're going to end with reflections on new and future directions for South African historiography. So Professor Simpson, it's all yours, and we're looking forward, and thank you again.
Thank you very much, Dr. Olofse and Professor Thula, and above all to Professor Passimiers for organizing everything and being the artistic director of slides. Now, by the mid-2010s, it was impossible not to notice an accumulation of social, economic, and political stress in South Africa. These contestations coexisted with a settled understanding in the public sphere about the relationship between South Africa's past and present, namely that it was one of overcoming past division and conflict. Now, implicit in this understanding was the belief that everything worth assimilating from the past had been absorbed into the present, in the sense of providing a sufficient basis to secure redress, reconciliation, reconstruction, and the other public goods of the new South Africa. Such an historical outlook, however, naturally raised a question that you yourselves as members of history departments in South Africa have fielded about whether South African history remained a worthwhile field of inquiry. In an important sense, this popular historical consciousness was actually reinforced by the prevailing historiography. By the mid-2010s, I had a promontory from which to view these questions, being the lecture of the rise and fall of segregation and apartheid at the University of Pretoria. Now, the content of that course rested on the existing secondary literature. The 1990s was a time of the great flourishing of general histories of South Africa. The adoption of the 1990s as a terminus in many accounts reinforces the narrative of South African history as being one of overcoming past division on the path to democracy. But beyond the end of history lies further histories, as new centers of interest are constantly thrown up from which to view the past, and South Africa offers no exception in this regard. Since the mid-2010s, the tempo of the process that I discussed in my introduction has accelerated. This includes the aggravation of class divides and more heated debates over how to redress apartheid's legacies, which pose new questions about the country's path forward. By 2022, as you'll all be aware, it's become conventional to describe South Africa as being in something of a crisis. Now, these developments for me lie at the heart of a historiographical dilemma in the following sense. Firstly, the tenacity of the challenges raise an issue about whether the base of examples we have are sufficiently wide as we were confident in the past to address the challenges of the present. Do we not need a wider base? That creates the possibility of there increasingly, possibly, being a need for original, empirical, historiographical studies capable of providing episodes of illuminating the present. But there's also a second sense in which the present opens new questions of the past, because we know more than past generations about the long-term significance of past events. And this provides a basis for us to ask new questions of the past. There is another major contributor to the existing framing of South African historiography, and this pertains even in works that extend past the 1990s. And this is the fact that after 1994, a plethora of new archives have become available to researchers. Laszlo, could we go to the second slide here? Now, these alternative anti-apartheid archives involve not just unearthing documents of the old, formerly underground and prescribed movements. It also includes the initiation of various projects aimed at recording the history, most notably through oral history projects, which are aimed at expanding the archive. Yes, there was a destruction of records to some extent by the outgoing apartheid regime, but this was countered by initiatives, most notably the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where, as you know, amnesty was provided in exchange for full disclosure, and this has contributed to swelling the archives. In a sense, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is the development of a whole new alternative archive. My first book on the ANC's armed struggle rested on these new archives. The capacity to conduct research on those topics had previously been limited by the records being part of an ongoing war. I was involved after 1994 in the declassification of many records of significance. There's also another dimension in the archives, which is the increasing availability of foreign repository documents as a result of normal 20, 30-year declassification processes. I was able to conduct research in countries including Botswana, Swaziland, Zambia, Zimbabwe. Archives in the West were also opening up, including those of the anti-apartheid movement and those in the Eastern Bloc as well. And these all provided new perspectives on national liberation. For example, the Labatsi conference, it was the conference at which the ANC formally adopted Umkhonto Sizwe as an organ of the movement. Initially, when Nelson Mandela received the authorization, it had been the fiction that Umkhonto Sizwe was an orphan. It was only at the Labatsi conference where the armed struggle was officially adopted by the ANC. Because of the highly secret nature of the discussions, there hasn't been much in the way of archival documentary records. We've basically had oral history accounts. But in the Czechoslovakian archives, there is a distinct documentary record in those files detailing exactly what was agreed at Labatsi. So these new records enabled us to have a clearer idea of the history of national liberation. But there's a further important extension of South African historiography, which is that it enables it to become integrated into larger transnational frames. All of these archives opening up give us a source base on which to consider the whole subcontinent of Southern Africa as a single theatre of conflict, and how Southern Africa is integrated into larger conflicts, including the North-South conflict in Africa between the decolonized North and the minority and settler-ruled South, and also the ways in which this enabled the penetration of Cold War processes. The newness of the records meant inevitably that the community working on them is initially small but ever growing. The nature of my research, however, meant that my publication stopped where the material extended beyond the ANC's armed struggle. But the process of doing the research made me aware that there were many aspects of those records that bore relevance to contemporary developments in South Africa, including, but not limited to, the rise of the ANC, which is obviously a major theme in post-apartheid South African life. But as I said in the introduction, the present also provides a basis for the reconsideration and reinterpretation of the past in terms of providing new insights. And this provides a basis by which to engage with the existing secondary literature on traditional themes in South African historiography, but also to revisit the archives of earlier periods and perhaps get different readings from that source material. Being based in Pretoria, the home of many of the national archives in South Africa, provided an excellent basis on which to engage this kind of research. So what I'm doing is describing and justifying, I hope, the basis for what might be considered an unconventional move, which is doing research on the general history of South Africa, and why I felt that the moment was right in the 2010s to do that. Laszlo, could we please go to slide 3, please? I also wanted to deal with problems beyond the armed struggle as a historian, to look at the South African experience in all its diversity, economic, social, cultural, intellectual, scientific and technological, as well as politico-military. A general history offered a sufficiently broad canvas on which to illustrate that larger story. Writing the book was commenced in October 2014, just after submitting my previous one on Umkhonto Sizwe to the publisher. As with any history, the objective of the new history of South Africa is to account for change over time. And the change over time focused specifically on the following issue. Considering the history of South Africa as it evolved from the time when the term South Africa ceased to be a mere geographical expression, and to explore the evolution of the meaning of the terms South Africa and South Africans over time.
All right. People mute their microphones, please.
Please just mute your microphone, the new attendant. Thank you. Thank you, Prof Simpson.
Thank you. So this aspiration of accounting for the changing in the change in the definition and meaning of the term South Africa and South Africans necessitated a different pace from the book on Umkhonto Sizwe. The book on MK was of a protracted conflict that proceeded over a widely dispersed area. The aim was to give a sense of the false starts, the cul-de-sacs, and the apparently innocuous beginnings, because it's a very protracted, low-intensity war. A lot of the episodes of the armed struggle fall outside the mainstream main events in South African history. There are moments of juncture, which I needed to provide justification and explanation for when Umkhonto Sizwe enters into that broader history. But on the whole, I needed to give a sense of the large aspects of the narrative which fell outside. By contrast, the history of South Africa that I've just published focuses exclusively, almost entirely, on those major processes, major turning points in that central history of South Africa. In developing the text, there are 3 criteria that guided the choices that I made regarding which content to include and exclude. And these choices reflect 3 main forms of historical significance that I feel exist. First measure is immediate significance, namely the meaning that contemporaries who lived through the events gave to them. This is based, as I put it in the preface of the book, that each generation chooses its heroes for the time in which it lives and can only fairly be judged on the knowledge available to it. One of the things that maintaining the integrity of this immediate data of historical consciousness preserves is avoiding taking present-day definitions of terms South Africa and South Africans for granted, of avoiding treating eventual outcomes as eternal realities, and thereby mistaking for being essential and necessary what is contingent and therefore reversible and itself subject to change. The importance of such an approach can perhaps be illustrated best by examples, and it's on that basis that I would like us to proceed to the next slide, please, to try and narrate what I mean in this regard. Please, Lazo, can we go to slide 4? Thank you very much. Now, on the top left-hand side of the screen, there's Lord Alfred Milner, and the document there, please don't try and enlarge it. It's there for the purpose of showing that it exists and proving due diligence myself and going through the archives. It's titled, Suggestions as to the Policy to Pursue when the Transvaal and the Free State have been Conquered. It's a confidential paper from May 1900. And in that paper, Lord Milner recommends a policy of assisted immigration to what he says anglicize the white population of the two Boer republics. What Milner's famous anglicization policy reminds us is what was obvious in the context of the then ongoing Anglo-Boer War, but is arguably been forgotten subsequently, that the greatest threat to colonization at the time came from within the white community, from the Boer population. In pursuing anglicization, Milner's wish was to ensure, in the words of a memorandum from 1901 that I've included there in the top right-hand corner, that within the existing generation, the deeply rooted ambition of a united South Africa under its own flag would gradually perish. If you look at the papers of Milner during the war and in the immediate post-war period, you see that he realized that the threat existed beyond the Boer population. He identified it as also coming from the white English-speaking population as well, who were no less anxious for self-government. In other words, there was a divide amongst the Anglos on this question. What he feared was the development of a common settler front against the colonial government. What this should remind us is that the immediate danger to colonialism was therefore from white settler nationalism. And it's this settler nationalism that also served to give shape to South African historiography. Professor Miles Taylor of York University reminds us that the first generation of historians at universities in the British dominions of the empire tended to be Oxford-trained generalists who were often dismissive of the indigenous histories of their adopted countries. As an example, Taylor cited John Edgar, the first King George V chair at the University of the Cape of Good Hope in 1903, therefore by my estimation perhaps the first professional historian in South Africa, who once opined that the history of South Africa taken by itself is not perhaps a very educative study. Taylor reminds us that it was left to amateurs such as William Kingsford in Canada and the Canadian George Thiel in South Africa to write sweeping national narratives. It was only in the 1920s that professional historians viewed it as being part of their responsibilities to write sweeping general histories. Now, Thiel notoriously took the settler viewpoint against what he characterized as being misguided and often malevolent interventions from metropolitan and humanitarian interests. The capacity of this settler narrative to transcend ethnic divides was reflected in the later embrace by Afrikaner nationalist historians of the works and the interpretations provided by Thiel and George Corey, the two Georges who are there reproduced in the middle of your picture. It reminds us of a fact that is underscored by South Africa's subsequent constitutional development, that the history of decolonization should be seen as one that divides the white community and not only runs through them. Milner used a Congress of Transvaal municipalities on the 18th of May 1903 to address the question of post-war racial policy. He was keen to appease pro-settler opinion and show that he spoke the same language. He disassociated himself, and this is the slide. This is the graphic which is on the bottom right-hand side from the Eastern Province Herald. He was keen to disassociate himself from what he called the claptrap of Exeter Hall, a reference to the building in London that had once hosted meetings of the Anti-Slavery Society, proving his toughness, that he wasn't one of these soft-hearted humanitarians. But he also used the opportunity to champion what he called the British idea that civilization rather than color should form the basis of race relations. But in the process, he exposed the limitations of this cardinal insistence of the South African liberal tradition. He emphasized that for all practical purposes, it was perfectly compatible with the maintenance of white supremacy. Among other things that he said in this presentation was that as far as political rights for Africans and coloreds were concerned, that was a question which would be deferred to a legislative assembly which, as per the Treaty of Vereeniging, would be whites only. He also explicitly called for the prohibition of Asian immigration, though once again on the grounds of civilization rather than color. The racism of color blindness in South Africa is what he was pushing for. It might be thought that the transparent hypocrisy of this imperial civilizing mission would lead Africans, coloreds, and Indians to reject it outright. But once again there, the politics of identity in South Africa was much more complex. And I want to explain this by moving on to the next slide, if we could go there, please. Milner eventually lost in his struggle against the settler nationalists. In other words, self-government came before Anglicization was achieved. What I've highlighted on this page are two documents. The one on the left is is a response to the 1909 Draft Act for the Union of South Africa, in which the white negotiators imposed a color bar on the non-European franchise everywhere except the Cape. When the South African Native Convention met at their famous meeting in Bloemfontein for the 24th to the 26th of March 1909, the resolutions they adopted called for the revision of the Draft Act to incorporate the principle, and I quote here, but I've also highlighted it, they called for the negotiators to adopt the principle which was also the constant motto of the late Cecil John Rhodes, to whom a united South Africa was also an ideal, viz., equal rights for all civilized men from the Cape to the Zambezi. Now, such invocations of Cecil Rhodes and Alfred Milner might be read as tactical maneuvers forced on black politicians by the power balance at the time, but there's evidence that the attraction of the British idea had deeper roots. The South African Native Convention met again in 1910 and again in 1911, when they reached agreement to form a new permanent organization. This is the background of African nationalism in South Africa, because the permanent organization was the South African Native National Congress, which later became the ANC. The image which I've introduced there is of John Dube. If there's a figure, if we're talking about figures in the pantheon of black nationalism and African nationalism, John Dube is surely a central one, as the first president of what later became the ANC. On the 2nd of February 1912, and this is the document that I've reproduced there, in his first speech after being elected president of the SANNC, Dube invoked multiple sources that he said would guide him in leading the new organization. One of them was ancestry more ancient than any around us, but another was the role of Africans as citizens of what he termed the glorious British Empire. These indigenous and imperial identities were mixed in him within other international ones. For example, he declared Booker T. Washington to be his patron saint and guiding star, before proclaiming that his war cry was onward, upward, into the higher places of civilization and Christianity, and not downward into the abyss of antiquated tribal systems. It's not the only one of his statements from the time which would be highly problematic if they were used by a 21st century historian to characterize what is happening in the first decade of the 20th century. But you see from these comments that his identity was a hybrid of native, transatlantic, and imperial identities. We could purify him to fit with our present conceptions of what an African politician should be, but that would be a posthumous clarification of what is contained in these documents. We could also speculate that Dube privately held 21st century consciousness about these things, but that would be pure speculation, and it would be contradicted by what we know, by what he and other founders of the ANC felt about developments that helped to shape our contemporary understandings of nationalism. For example, we know how they responded to the initial penetration of Bolshevik ideas into South Africa after the Russian Revolution. Now, some of my historian contemporaries will say this is South African History 101 that I'm reciting here. And my response to that would be, yes, it should be. But as specialists of South African history, we'd have to admit that in the face of what are often brutal simplifications of questions of identity in the 21st century, we have had limited success as a profession in inserting consciousness of this hybridity, of this cultural appropriation into common everyday understandings of how identities of being South African have evolved over time. I want to move into the next slide here, if we can, please. Can we migrate, please? If you could, slide 6, Lazo, thank you. The demise of South African liberalism was a process rather than an event. Socialism's triumph would take a generation to be accomplished. The issue of processes of revaluation touch on the second principle that I try to tackle in the narrative. Specifically, how from event to event, relations inherited from conquest were gradually reconfigured to collectively become distinctive, recognizable eras of colonialism, of apartheid, of segregation, and majority rule by which we understand South African history. How do we see the wood from the trees as far as this is concerned? The progression that I speak of is the one by which quantitative changes become qualitative ones. Now, what I'm trying to discuss here is a process that can be traced in most archives. It is true, as archival theorists have pointed out to us, that they reflect the ideology of the individuals, groups, and organizations responsible for creating them. But it is also the case, I feel, that their content focuses on grappling, the producers of the content, archival content, on grappling with the problems and crises that challenge ideological frames. The focus is always on objective reality that can't be wished away by ideology. That is the central tension. Now, sometimes the facts can be shaped into conformity with the interests of the powers who are responsible for creating the archives, but this is invariably after a process of attrition that renders impossible the restoration of the status quo ante. If the problems are solved, they disappear, but sometimes the ideas have to give way to the facts. And the Fagan Commission of the 1940s offers a good illustration of what I'm speaking about. It defined its objectives as being to look into the principles guiding the laws, and specifically the laws that upheld territorial segregation as defined above all by the 1913 Land Act. The National Party famously disagreed with the Fagan Commission's findings. It had an alternative policy of apartheid that was aimed at making territorial segregation work. The history of apartheid offers a further example of the process of attrition that I've tried to describe in this section, in this slide. As late as the early 1960s, the boom in South Africa, economic boom that South Africa faced from the early 1960s onwards, created a skills shortage that led to demand among employers for more skilled and semi-skilled non-white labor. If you accept the argument that the apartheid state existed to achieve white prosperity, then you can see how this issue created a policy dilemma for the architects of apartheid. And it's one which I would argue, and I provide supporting evidence in the book, that the architects of apartheid were never able to solve. Under H.F. Verwoerd, supposedly the great architect of apartheid and the upholder of granite apartheid, a blind eye was consistently turned to erosions of the color bar in industry. And I feel that there was no stage at which a coherent response was offered to the objectives that Smuts made of what he called the apartheid nonsense when the policy was first proposed in the 1940s. By the 1970s, there was a discourse of reform to stave off the crisis facing the system as a result by a number of developments, including the Durban strikes, the 1975 to 76 war in Angola, and the Soweto uprising that all occurred earlier that decade. The centerpiece of reform under P.W. Botha was a new constitution, but the week it came into legal force in September 1984, South Africa's townships exploded. By the 1980s, the debate had moved beyond this or that legislative intervention to reform this or that aspect of apartheid, to reconsidering the principles informing the apartheid laws. That's where the debate within the National Party had progressed to. And I would argue that it's at such moments of the interrogation of fundamental principles, when that moves to that such reinterrogation rather than grappling with the details of particular policies, that we have the basis of the great realignments that have characterized South African history. F.W. de Klerk once put it that South African society was like a scrambled egg, and you can't unscramble an egg, when he was asked the reasons why the apartheid system eventually collapsed. Another metaphor for the same process can be provided in the words of Chief Albert Luthuli when speaking of a great shift in anti-apartheid politics. He was referring to the transition from non-violence to violence when he said, "Who will deny that that 30 years of my life have been spent knocking in vain, patiently, moderately, and modestly at a closed and barred door?" It's such process of attrition where policy budges up against facts that I think that we have the basis of these great policy paradigmatic shifts. Can we move to the next slide if possible? Now, this process of social attrition has bearings on how we interpret, I believe, macro-level change in South African historiography. I'm referring to the aspiration that has given distinctive character to South African historiography, namely the desire to structure the country's growth around a central theme, an overarching principle, which, according to the interpretation, is capable of linking past, present, and future. Cooperation, class struggle, and nationalism, both Afrikaner and African, are just some of the formulas that have been advanced by the respective interpretations as answering that question. The great controversies between the schools of South African historiography have centered on what that central theme might be. But my reading of South Africa's history wars suggests to me that they have followed a uniform pattern that suggests a different reading of the country's growth. Because in those wars, the tactical advantage has decisively been with those historians who've been on the defensive. In other words, each contender has been able to demonstrate against the attacks of others that their chosen theme has been an enduring one in the country's past, and it's one that has shaped developments elsewhere. A consequence of what I characterize to be the resulting tactical stalemates in these history wars is that no school has succeeded in its larger objective of driving its rivals from the field. Instead, the field has, over time, become increasingly cluttered with central explanatory themes. This suggests that there a possibility that ultimately the field will have to find space for all of these themes, and that if a new line of interpretation were introduced, say changing climate and environment, it would be by addition rather than subtraction from the others. Within this framework, the analysis of South African society at any stage would be in terms of the relations between these themes. And while it would be possible to discern moments of uniform movement when a particular theme disproportionately shapes the trajectory of others, for example, when Afrikaner or African nationalism is dominant, thereby serving as a center of power within the system as a whole, developments anywhere would potentially carry the system-wide consequences, for example, the rise of African nationalism within the bosom of Afrikaner nationalist domination, and have the potential over time to contribute to large-scale power shifts in society. This interpretation of the development of South African history touches on the third major aspect of the selection of content in the book, in that the account extends, quote, to the present, end quote, reconsidering events that I have lived through, witnessed, and in certain occasions even participated in. In the end, the present was a 6 to 7 year period from the initiation of the writing of the book, or researching of the book, to the eventual publication. And the publication takes us right up to the events of July 2021 with the insurrection there. Now, writing the history of the present places us as historians in the hot seat that we often place preceding generations. Historical judgment often involves taking potshots at predecessors, but with the benefit of resources unavailable to them, including, of course, most critically, knowledge of the outcome of these processes. The history of the present, as I say, places us in that position. Not writing history per se, but marshalling history as a resource for interpreting unfolding events in terms of their potential significance, significance which will only be known by future generations. Now, this raises the question of whether post-apartheid South Africa is subject to the same rules which I've discussed in trying to explain the overall macro-level change that occurred under segregation and apartheid. The transition of from apartheid, by my reading, shows that many problems are simply solved with the adoption of a different point of view and a perspective. Apartheid notoriously generated a whole series of racial puzzles and intractable color questions, but many of the most intractable questions and conflicts simply disappeared in 1994. This is a genuine liberation, including of energy and resources that can be devoted elsewhere. But the fact that certain problems can be resolved also shows that the locus of conflict in society can shift and new centers of gravity begin to arise. One source of a number of difficulties became discernible as early as the 90 days of the new dispensation. During that period, there were initial contestations which were informed by the radical interpretation which was dominant at the time. By the radical interpretation, I mean the understanding of South African history as being focused on the role of race and class in the making of poverty. This interpretation is very much based on developments within South Africa and what one group of South Africans is doing to another. It's one which accords a secondary place for transnational developments, but it's striking that during those early 90 days after apartheid contestations, a number of people, almost all non-historians, based in disciplines outside historiography, including the economy, they pointed out the importance of transnational perspectives with which are central for interpreting their data. They pointed out that the new South Africa was emerging into and returning to the international community, not as a uniquely impoverished country, but rather a middle-income one, with a median salary which is actually above the world average and 50% of Africa's industrial output. The arguments which they made were that the danger facing the country was one of the so-called middle-income trap, where labor is no longer cheap, but at the same time not yet skilled enough to compete for international trade. Story of inequality, in other words, is an important one for sure, but it's not the only one that should have been occupying the minds of the developers of policymakers. Any doubt about the reality of the issues that were made by these observers of these contestations should have been disabused by numerous refractory data, for example, the situation at the country's borders with the surge of migrants from across the country looking to be dealt into the situation in South Africa, which many people were characterized as being irredeemably low-wage and characterized by poverty. This transnational perspective, of course, complicates our picture of the legacy of the past from the present, but it's one which surely had implications in a number of policy-making spheres, whether trade, labor relations, migration, education. All legislative and judicial processes surely had to take account of it at the risk of catastrophic policy failure. 90 days is, of course, not enough to identify consequences, but the immediate post-apartheid period was a short enough time to see in clear perspective the potential volatility of many of these new post-apartheid themes. For example, as early as January 1995, we had the marching of foreigners to police stations in Alexandra for allegedly stealing jobs, as well as violent protests which led to deaths of foreigners in other parts of the country. Since then, of course, much of which had been incipient then has become chronic, and this has become a major source of the accumulation of stress that I described in the introduction, but it's only one. Writing contemporary history stresses the importance, I feel, of antiquarian and what is often dismissed as antiquarian history, or history conducted for its own sake. This is because the relations between the past and the present are never static for reasons that I've tried to discuss with regards to shifting centers of gravity and new themes always arising. One consequence of this is that the barrier between what is antiquarian and what is living is malleable. Can we move to the next slide if possible? Eric Walker's History of South Africa, published in 1928, offers one illustration of this reality. He identifies the most important factors in the country's history since its unification in 1910 as being the shifting relationship between black and white labor. In Walker's account, the Spanish flu of 1918 merited not a single mention. He considered it not to be important. But I would defend his interpretation as being perfectly valid from the perspective of the time in which he wrote, the South Africa for which most readers would have been looking for a history of. Indeed, if we look at the liberal and radical historians that followed over the next couple of generations, they focused in their different ways on aspects of South Africa's social and economic history. Afrikaner historiography, which with its nationalist theme had a different orientation, but it equally had a focus which offered little place for issues of public health. But I submitted my book proposal early in 2020, just prior to the imposition of the COVID-19 lockdown. And clearly a history written in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis had to reconsider the standard mission of public health. And the COVID-19 crisis, I believe, raises a larger historiographical issue. Briefly put, a naturalistic account can't be centered narrowly on the means of production. Nature enters into history in many other ways, and with no less profound consequences, as the history of the Spanish flu, COVID-19 and HIV/AIDS in South Africa, but internationally also Black Death and smallpox illustrates. Contemporary engagements regarding the dangers of climate change and the Anthropocene highlight another important category in which nature enters into history. Antiquarian history, history for its own sake, thereby helps to push back against a common refrain that has often been offered during these times. I'm referring now to the 2010s, the claim that we're entering into uncharted waters. A larger perspective often reveals how little is actually unforeseeable about the times in which we traverse, even with a period of just over 100 years that is covered in the book. And the period that I cover in the book offers a corrective against another common refrain that we have great policies but are poor in implementation. This is a reading of our travails which surely needs to be thought through again. Policy involves matching means with ends, not just articulating ends. I can mention numerous things that I would like to have, but that's not a policy. A policy involves me laying out a process about how I will get there. Policy is hard. It involves planning and preparation, monitoring and evaluation, all those terms of managerial speak. And in terms of making policy, it is as interdisciplinary as it comes. It involves fusing history, sociology, economics, and any number of other disciplines. It also entails a huge moral responsibility. To the extent at which the policy is incorrect, it has consequences that are measured in human lives. Faulting implementation means saying the policy-making process is defective in all of these regards, in terms of, i.e., planning, predicting, and foreseeing. If this is the case and policy implementation consistently yields results that are wide of the mark, it's just the policy is perhaps with the framework of assumptions, including the historical ones that inform those policies. That brings me back, in conclusion, to de Klerk and Luthuli and the point I tried to make in that aspect of the presentation. We can stop sharing slides now, it's perfectly fine. And what the points that they made about knocking on closed doors and unscrambling eggs. COVID-19 is a once-in-a-century shock, but it aggravated many aspects of a crisis that long predated it. In other words, its effects were largely quantitative, having a compounding effect on the social and economic stress that led me to first write my book. But this, if my interpretation of macro-level change in South African history is correct, this brings us on to the issue of qualitative change. And I must introduce a disclaimer that there's nothing melodramatic about what I'm trying to say here. The position of readjustment of ideas and facts is one that is experienced by every society at every stage in history. What I'm doing is merely challenging the odd idea that post-apartheid South Africa might ever have been an exception to this rule. As I said in the introduction, by now it's conventional to say that South Africa is poised on a precipice. I have tried in this presentation to discuss the potential changes that this might entail in historiographical terms. One of the striking differences in the period between the publication of the book in August 2021 and now is that there's a clear sign, for example, that the electoral and economic arithmetic by which post-apartheid has hitherto been based has now changed, and that in the terms of the mood of the country, the status quo that had existed on public debates and many other things, we may possibly have already entered into the post-apartheid era. If this is correct, it would raise the possibility that South Africa may, in the second quarter of the 21st century, be poised for a realignment as profound as those that the country experienced in the early, mid, and late 20th century. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Simpson, much appreciated. Maybe I can just set the bar and then we can get more questions. I want you to just focus a little bit on how did you manage to balance the issue of objectivity as we all strive to be as historians, because it's a very contemporary history and you yourself have lived through and witnessed and even participated in many of these events that you're actually explaining here in your book. And the selection of contemporary history where we know it's sometimes difficult to verify the events as the verification, the significance thereof lies in the future. How did you balance this objectivity on the one hand, but also selection that goes along with very, very, very contemporary history? Some people will say contemporary history starts in the 19th century, but this is even much more contemporary. How did you balance that? Thank you.
Yeah, there's many layers of that which are related to the theme that I'm trying to introduce in the presentation. Firstly, maintaining the importance of objectivity with regards to the past is how people in the past saw it. The reason why that is important to maintain that is because it provides different perspectives. It unsettles dogma, prejudice, and sort of mistaking for being essential what isn't essential. And I would maintain the importance of doing that. Also with regards to unveiling potential aspects of the past which could be open from the present. So I would very much maintain the importance of objectivity and sense of researching the past for history in its own sake. That should not be mistaken for objectivity in terms of the present. Now, with regards to writing about the present and the unforeseen future, there's the following sense. Firstly, using the past to interpret the present, and there's two ways of doing that which are important. Firstly, the direction in which the country is going, and using past precedents to try and predict that future. There's another important thing. It's not just saying that we're heading for an iceberg, and I've now predicted the future, because there's also a moral and ethical aspect to that as well, and that involves also trying to point out alternatives. And this is an important thing that came when I was writing the history of the present. It was, in a sense, writing a history that's moving in two directions. Because I do not believe the country to be on the right trajectory, which is the reason why I wrote the history in the first place, it involved articulating, using evidence, data to say, look, from past evidence, we can understand the direction we're going, and it's in this direction. But also at the same time, introducing enough alternatives from the South African past, from that antiquarian, lost in the past, people no longer refer to it now because it's lost in the memory hole, of alternative directions which could potentially enable us to steer. There's many aspects to objectivity, writing the facts and using them, but they're employed in a history and in this history, not in any one single way, but in these multiple ways in which writing a history from the past to the present. Objectivity has many different uses, and these are some of them that I've tried to articulate in the presentation and also in this answer as guiding the approach that I adopted.
Thank you so much. Dr. Pasamias, you have a question.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Simpson, for your presentation, and congratulations once again on your book. In your presentation, you mentioned the availability of alternative archives that you made use of to write this general history, and their usefulness to construct new narratives as part of that history. But what about the state of the national archives in your quest to write this history? How useful were the national archives to write more recent periods, write about more recent periods in South African history? And then I had another question. Apart from starting your general history of South Africa in 1902 and not 1910, as often has been the case, are there any new ways of periodization that we as historians should approach South African history with, instead of the classic sort of 1910 to 48, 48 to 1994, and 1904 to the present? Is there a new, exciting, or more useful way in which we should periodize our history? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, with regards to archives, the paper archives on the National Archives are useful up until roughly the 1980s. It's a very interesting dimension, which we won't have time to grapple with sufficiently here, but I do believe that it will become a thing in South African historiography in the future. One of the striking things about writing the history of the present is the importance of digital. And with rolling 24 New Hour coverage, with citizen journalists, and all of these other means, it is virtually impossible for people who try to filter government information to do it entirely well. Data hacks as well, Gupta leaks, etc. We have access to much more information than previous generations. We have deluges of information. And even under COVID-19, where you have these very long, hours-long press conferences, it's almost, or the speakers have found it almost impossible to maintain message discipline. So I've actually found that to actually be a treasure trove of original source material, which previous generations would kill for. For example, writing about the July 2021 protests, not just being restricted to a paper document, which is filtered through what, firstly, the generators of the archive thought was fit to include in there, and also what they felt a generation later fit to declassify. Having basically cell phone footage, it's been a huge treasure trove, and there's all sorts of methodological questions which are interesting to explore. And I do believe that to the extent at which people now work with these digital sources rather than paper, it will eventually transform how we write historiography. I've had an important sense that from roughly the first decade of the 21st century, that there's a whole different source basis of writing historiography. This also, by the way, includes access to government documents, which are basically available digitally in many respects. Now, with regards to periodization, as I tried to say in the introduction, the figures of speech that we use to classify South Africa, one of the things that I was interested to do is what makes the apartheid era and the post-apartheid era and the era of segregation, the era of colonialism. In a sense, my categorization was using these figures of speech and trying to explain what gives them coherence. So in a sense, I was working within those frames, but trying to explain them in different ways. And that involved going to individual events, which could be viewed as being turning points, major episodes, in South African historiography, and trying to go from event to event and trying to see how within the bosom of one dispensation, the basis of a new dispensation emerged. And that was the framework that I used in the chapters which I have, you know, in the table of contents, I don't break it down into book 1, apartheid, you know, book 2, post-apartheid or whatever. They're sort of over 30 chapters, but those 30 chapters are how we can periodize the making and unmaking of these respective dispensations. That's the narrative approach I make. So there's elements of conventional periodization, but also unconventional chapter structures with regards to finding different explanations of the building from one phase to another.
Thank you, Professor Simpson. We have another hand up. I don't know if I pronounced correctly. Lingiwe.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Professor, for your presentation. I have just one question. In choosing themes of South African history, who do you think you hurt and who do you think you please? I say so because in the United States of America, there's a problem of the teaching of critical race theory in some states. So are there deliberate omissions and inclusions in your book which address South Africa's status of a rainbow nation? Thank you.
Yes, in terms of inclusion and exclusion, there's many things which previous generations were obsessed by, which are simply not interesting to us. So even whilst maintaining the integrity of writing about what previous generations considered to be interesting, that's not an absolute thing. Some of them are interesting to us and are worth including in a book written in the 21st century. But in a sense, I've maintained a sense of veto over not all content is included there. With regards to the, whilst there are differences on many themes, there are certain things on which people agree on. And what I tried to introduce in the conclusion is that there is a growing consensus in the third decade of this century, that the country, in terms of many important metrics, is not moving in the direction that people want it to be going in. There's just general understanding. The people who are happy about the trajectory, who feel as though the future is going to be better than it is now if the country continues in the present trajectory, is not high and it's declining. People differ on their analysis and their explanation. What I've tried to do is give a historically grounded explanation of where the country's come from and how that historical reading might enable us to interpret the present. It is as fallible as any, and in the sense to which its writing of the present and many aspects of the future that it predicts are not written yet, it is subject to being proven incorrect in the future. But it is putting my judgment out there, and you can test whether my interpretation is correct or not. In a sense, as I said in the presentation, it's putting me in the same hot seat as we put previous generations, where we sort of hang them based on their incorrect judgments, their follies and their mistakes. So future generations will tell whether it's right or wrong. But my interpretation of the present is basically my interpretation of the present controversies, the directions in which they can be predicted to go, and also providing some sort of indication based on the analysis of potential alternatives paths that could be developed. And those are the basic criteria that I've tried to follow with regards to selection of content.
Thank you, Professor. Any more questions? Professor Simpson, maybe this is an unfair question, but the book is now finished and done. We have the final version, it's on the shelves. But looking back, is there something you would have added or changed? Because, for example, there's no list of sources. Would you prefer, or was it something done on purpose to omit that? I was just wondering, sometimes you look at something, you think, oh my word, maybe I should have done this or add that, just in retrospect.
In terms of adding, I mean, there's a very short, simple answer that in terms of the length of the book, I feel that the book is sometimes strengthened if you make yourself be concise, get to the point more quickly. So just as a sense of including content, I would not have wished to add more content. In a sense, I'm still in the present that I was in when I decided that the book was done and sent it off to publishers. So that really hasn't changed. So at the moment, I wouldn't change it yet, but I will obviously in the future as gremlins and faux pas and errors emerge. There are a couple of typos. I would obviously change that. But at the moment, I'm sort of still in the moment that I was in August 2021 in terms of judgment and predictions, which is not to say that the book is perfect. It's just to say that it's still the same present that I was in at the time. So there's not fundamental restructuring that I would do yet.
Perfect. Dr. Pasimiers, your hand is up. Something you want to add or ask?
I had a fairly similar question to you.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Professor Simpson, then we would just like to thank you that you've taken us on a journey that you had with this book, all the insights and challenges. We really appreciate your time, and we really wish you a blessed and very insightful, productive year. ahead on all your academic endeavors. And yeah, again, congratulations on this epic work that you've made available for us as historians and also for the general public out there to have a different view on our general history of South Africa. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your time and for the rest of the year, including with the seminar series. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.